Useful or not, having triple 100 stats is a flex. Everybody wants it. Now don't get me wrong, getting triple 100 stats isn't necessarily hard by any means, but it can be quite difficult when you need to run certain fragments and exotics. That's why I'm going to be showing you how to farm the best armor and which ones are actually worth farming and which ones are not. Now without further ado, let's just get straight into it. Before we get into how to grind for the armor, I'm going to explain a few things about how the armor stats actually work and how they're distributed. Many people know about the bucket system, but for those who don't, let me explain quickly. There are 6 total armor stats and they are split into 2 buckets of 3. The first bucket, let's call it bucket 1, is mobility, resilience and recovery, and the second bucket, bucket 2, is discipline, intellect and strength. Now for legendary armor pieces, each of these buckets can have a total of 34 stats. Each stat will have a minimum of 2 points, so the most you can get in each individual stat is 30, and because there are 2 different buckets, you can get a total of 68. That is the highest on a base legendary piece of armor. Exotics do work a little bit differently. In essence, they are the exact same, except some exotics have additional stats on top of what you get at base. One example is transversive steps. They're always going to drop with +1 recovery and +1 to mobility. So in this case, the highest total you can get on transversive steps is 70. There is a whole list of exotics which have this benefit, and I'll put the link to that in the description. I'm not sure who made this list, I sort of just found it on Google, so thank you to them. Another thing to keep in mind is that Artifice armor will let you add +3 stat points into any armor stat you want. This is a +3 stats on top of the base stats you already have, and with the release of the final shape you can make any exotic Artifice, so the highest for an exotic Artifice is 74. That's because some exotics can get up to 71 base. We're going to talk more later on about how to get the legendary Artifice armor, so knowing all of this, we can safely say that if you want to get triple 100 stats, you are somewhat restricted on what stats you can get. For example, you can't get 100 mobility, 100 recovery and 100 resilience all at the same time. You're going to need to have 100 in discipline, intellect or strength. So in short, you can't have triple 100 stats in a singular bucket. You need to have at least one from the other bucket. I hope that makes sense. The next thing we're going to talk about is the ghost focusing. Now I'm sure you all know by now that you can focus armor stats with your ghost. So you can just go here and select whichever stat you want to focus on your ghost, and this should guarantee at least 10 stat points in whichever stat you choose. I'm going to make a video in the future focusing on which stats are actually worth getting and which stats actually give very little benefit. So subscribe if you want to see that. That one should be coming very soon. But to summarize just a little bit, you are always going to want resilience in PvE. Resilience is by far the most important stat because it gives you damage reduction at all times. This stat should always be at 100, no matter the build. The next stats you should spec into are very subjective and it depends on your build entirely. If you have a grenade spam build, you're obviously going to want to go into discipline. Same for melee and strength. And the third stat is typically focused into whichever stat your class ability is linked to. So for warlocks, that's recovery, titans, that's resilience, and hunters, that's mobility. So clearly titans have the best time around here because they're going to be at 100 resilience anyway. So now we know how all the armor works and how Bungie actually makes the distributions work. We can move on to how to actually get the armor. The most common source, which most people use, is the episode vendor armor. I'm just going to call it the seasonal armor because it's much easier than saying the episodic armor or whatever the hell. That sounds weird. The seasonal armor is the best legendary armor in the game apart from Artifice armor. Obviously this means you're going to have to buy each episode. If you want the armor from that specific episode, you're going to have to farm the echo engrams, as each armor piece costs 2 engrams when you focus them directly. They only cost 1 when you focus a random engram, so that means you can get a helmet, chest, leg, arms or class item randomly. To farm these engrams, you're really just going to get it from anything you do in the game, any activity, or you can just do the seasonal activities and get a bunch more engrams. So just play the game as you normally do and you will get these engrams. So now that you've earned a bunch of engrams, how do you actually turn them into armor? That's quite easy. You just go to the seasonal vendor, look for the armor focusing section and buy whatever you need. In the previous seasons before the final shape, the random armor focusing would drop really high armor as well as the individual focusing, but for the current season / episode, that is not true. You're going to have to focus the armor pieces individually to get the high stats and the high spikes, and we don't know if that's going to be the case for any future episodes. So the way this works is you literally just buy an armor piece and it will give you whatever you have your ghost mod set to. So if I've got an intellect ghost mod and I buy a helmet, I'm going to get a helmet with a high intellect and a few more spikes in other stats. The seasonal armor is likely the best armor to farm because it's just super easy to get and it can give really high base stats with really good spikes. Other sources like Crucible, Strikes or even Gambit, if you play that, their armor can drop high but the spikes are terrible. Either that or the base stats are like 50, 55 in total. My personal rule of thumb is anything below 66 base total has to go. That is not good enough in my opinion. Here are some examples of armor pieces that I've got from previous seasons. As you can see, they're all pretty good. Some more armor, which is very similar to the seasonal armor, would be armor from dungeons. Now, it's not all dungeons, it's very specific. You get them from Pit of Heresy, and more specifically, the drops that come from the boss. This dungeon is actually rarely farmable. It comes around every so often, but when it does, you should for sure farm it. It's a very, very, very easy farm. Here are some examples of some armor that I've got from Pit of Heresy. They are all super juiced. Now that we're on the subject of dungeons, let's talk about the juicy, the stupendous, the outright godly Artifice armor.
The truth. I'm a god, boy.
You can get the Artifice armor from Master Dungeons or from Competitive Crucible. I've done a lot of Master Dungeon farming and I've noticed a few encounters to give pretty good armor, others give really bad armor. Firstly, the Warlord's Ruin dungeon can drop really good armor pieces. I would recommend farming the first boss as you don't really need to keep a CP. You can just start the dungeon and take 2 minutes running there. This farm is really good because it's fast and very easy. Plus, you can also farm for the Indebted Kindness, which I know many people love that sidearm. Here are some armor pieces that I've got from Warlord's Ruin. They are pretty juiced. Another good dungeon to farm would be the final boss in Grasp of Avarice. A great thing about this is you get double drops for each completion. That's twice as efficient as the previous farm, and you can also farm for one of my personal favorite PvP hand cannons in the game, Ias Luna. You can also farm for a half decent sniper, 1000-yard stare. This farm is much like Pit of Heresy, where you actually have to wait quite a while for it to become the weekly rotating dungeon, but whenever it does come around, I would highly recommend getting a team together and farming it. Here are some good armor pieces that I've got from Grasp of Avarice on Master. Now, the next way of getting Artifice, as I said before, is Competitive Crucible. This isn't everyone's favorite activity, understandably so. Now, the competitive Artifice armor is super weird. Sometimes they can be super cash money juices. Other times it would be the worst armor I've ever seen in my life. I'm talking about 59 base stat total. Absolute cheeks. I would show you some bad pieces which I've got, but I've instantly sharded them as soon as I got them. Except some of these pieces which have dropped have been super good. To be honest, I would only ever really consider doing comp if you actually enjoy Crucible. Even though comp is insufferable, I would still do it. All you have to do is be in gold rank or higher to get the Artifice armor, and even then getting the Artifice is a super rare drop from what I've seen, so do it at your own free will. You can also farm other dungeons like Duality or Spire, but from my experience, the armor drops have been really bad. Either that or the dungeon is just super long to farm. You're far better off doing the dungeons I mentioned earlier. So now that we know how to get Artifice armor, let's move on to the exotics. As far as we know, some exotics can get a +10 in a certain stat, but the exotics you focus at Rahul don't benefit from this at all. So what I mean by that is some exotics are guaranteed to get a +10 in, for example, strength. I believe Claws of Ahamkara is an example, but the reason we're not going to focus too much on that is because, as I said, when you do focus your engrams at Rahul, that whole mechanic sort of just gets ignored. So if you remember earlier on in the video when I said some exotics have a certain +1 or even +2 stats in some certain stats, the best thing to do here is look at the chart, find the exotic that you actually want, and then see which stats you are getting for free. Now, if you have, for example, a piece which gives you 1 mobility and 2 recovery, that means you shouldn't focus these 2 stats with your Ghost Shell mod because you're already getting a slight bump in them. So mathematically, you're better off focusing into the 3rd stat you want. You can also spend an exotic Cypher and some Glimmer, I believe, to make an exotic armor Artifice. And if you are serious about your builds and your stats, you should always be doing that. So now, how do you actually get these exotics? Well, there are many sources. You can get a total of 18 exotic engrams just from the episode season pass. You can get 9 a week from ritual activities. All 3 of these activities, Vanguard Strikes and Gambit, they all share the same 9 engrams, so it's not 9 each, it's 9 in total. When you level up any vendor, you can get them to do a reset, and then that will give you an engram. Zerk can sell exotics, but not engrams, so you can't focus those. But every Friday you should be looking out to see what he is selling. Some enemies can drop engrams as well, although it's not very common. It does happen quite a lot. I've been noticing it a lot more with the final shape. I'm not sure if they buffed that or what, but I can definitely notice it more. So there are so many exotic sources, I don't think you're going to be running out really. I'm definitely getting more exotic engrams than I can focus. That's why I haven't claimed any of my seasonal ones, because I just can't spend them. Right, that should just about sum up how armor works in Destiny 2, the video game, and how to actually get what you want. Now, to actually see which armor pieces you have to use to get certain stats that you want, there's this little website called D2 Armor Picker. I'm sure you guys are very familiar, but if you are not, there are many tutorials on YouTube on how to use it, so I'm not going to be going into too much detail here. earlier. But yeah, this website is incredible and it's free to all, so definitely check it out because it can show you which armor piece combos you need to put on to get these certain stats. And it can also show you how many different triple 100 stats or even quadruple 100 stat builds you can get. So yeah, check them out. But that should be it for the video. I'm going to be making a follow-up video to this one on which stats are actually good and which stats you should run for each class in whichever activities you're playing. Hopefully you guys could learn something from this video, and if you have, then be sure to leave a like. You should for sure subscribe if you love me. I do try to post really informative videos, mainly focused around PvP, so do that bell thingy to be notified every time I do upload, and hopefully you might enjoy that video too. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I hope to see you soon. Bye now.